15th of August 2025, the Isle of Man joined nations around the world in falling silent to mark the 80th anniversary of Victory over Japan Day. On this day in 1945, Japan unconditionally surrendered to Allied forces, marking the end of the Second World War. Over in England, at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire, a service of remembrance was held by the UK government and the Royal British Legion. One of those invited to the service was James Fenton, the last surviving Burma Star recipient who lives in Port Erin. After this year's service at the island's National War Memorial in St John's, we received word of another Manx resident with their own powerful story to tell. Celia Meade lives in Kirkmichael but was born in Burma, what is now known as Myanmar. Celia was just a small child when the war in the East broke out. Earlier this year, I visited her at her home to record for posterity the details of what happened to her in the years between 1942 and 1945. With a warning that this program includes content including descriptions of violence, sexual violence and suicide that some listeners may find distressing. These are her words. This is Celia Meade's story.
I've written this because I feel it should be told. I owe it to my grandparents, my uncle and my brother and all who died at the hands of the Japs. I owe it to my father who died some years after the war, broken in health and spirit, and who never recovered from the cruelties and privations meted out to him by our captors. I owe it to my mother. She nursed him continuously and tirelessly for the remainder of his life. She still has nightmares, waking at night weeping and afraid. I owe it to the countless numbers who died in the camps or afterwards as a direct result of the way they were treated. I owe it to myself for the childhood and innocence stolen from me. I owe it to the future generations who deserve to know exactly what happened before the warped apologists and modish revisionists changed history to their own politics. Most of all, I owe it to those wonderful men who risked and even sacrificed their lives to save ours. My father, a meticulous man in every way and deeply religious, whose faith never faltered even when he suffered atrociously, kept records of events stitched securely in the covers of his Bible. He was permitted to keep it because as a lay preacher he was authorized to perform funeral services. Unfortunately, these notes only covered the basic dates of events, the illnesses and deaths. He was very careful not to mention the ill treatments, the starvation, the despair, the degradation, the humiliation, as this would have been a death sentence for him if it had been discovered. As it was, he was taking a huge chance, because the Japs were equally careful to destroy all records which would have been used as evidence against them at the end of the war. In a couple of instances, my father actually says we were treated kindly by our captors. Years later, when I asked my mother bitterly why he had told such a blatant untruth, she told me that it was important to him that these notes should be preserved. If they had been discovered, the Japs might have permitted him to keep them, because they portrayed them in the light in which they needed to be portrayed, as kindly hosts. Had he told the truth, not only would the notes have been destroyed, but he would also have lost his life. I asked why he had taken such a risk. Because he believed firmly that after the war, families looking for loved ones deserved to know what had happened to them and where they would find a grave, my mother said. So, in his own unassuming way, my father too was a hero. So many deaths are recorded. 19,742, Claude Taylor died, buried C of E, grave number 64. 5th of the 8th, 43, Mr. Nichols died, buried C of E, grave number 48. 10th of the 8th, 43, Mr. Tresham died, buried RC, 11th of the 8th, 43. Mr. Hankinson died, 4th of the 9th, 43. Mrs. Jackson died, and so on, goes on and on. Unfortunately, with the passing of time, most of his writing has become illegible. My own story began, I suppose, when I was born, the 12th of September 1938, in a place called Meade'S in Burma. My father worked for the British government. I don't know what his work entailed, but I do know that he was officially entitled Inspector of Post and Telegraphs and travelled around the country quite a lot. We lived in a big house beside a lake. I have vague memories of walking with my ayah and throwing sticks into the water for the dogs to fetch. The other misty memories are of highly polished floors, of my room with a cot draped in a mosquito net right in the middle of the room, and of a blonde-haired boy called Timothy who used to come and play with me. I didn't like Timothy because he appropriated my toys. I know because I was told that we lived in something of a cloud cuckoo land, feeling perfectly safe in the knowledge that nothing could happen to us. The British government has told us so. And of course, if they said so, it must be true. Don't panic, they said. Stick at your post. This will all blow over in a short time. Just a few hundred yards down the road from our house was a British Army camp. What more could one need to feel safe? Then one morning, very early, my father heard a great deal of traffic movement. He went along to investigate and found the camp empty. He was shocked. These officers had been his friends. They used to come around in the evenings for a game of tennis and a drink, or maybe a game of backgammon with a whiskey glass clenched in their hands. Now they'd gone, and we were abandoned. Why didn't they warn us? For goodness sake, they were here last night drinking his rum, enjoying his hospitality. Now we were on our own. Suddenly people began to panic, dig air raid shelters, buried precious items, packed emergency cases. Some fled. This is where my own memories begin. Cameo memories which I've gathered together. My very first clear memory is of a screaming siren, being rushed into the shelter, which was packed with people. My parents, my baby brother Denny and myself, all the staff and their families, and of course the 2 dogs. Of frighteningly loud explosions, of the shelter collapsing, of being pushed out into the fresh air, my brother thrust into my arms, and being told to hold him tightly while those who were still buried, including my father, were rescued. I sat clutching Denny, both of us crying in terror, watching our house blaze. The noise, the loud bangs, the panic, the shouting. The house had scored a direct hit. That memory is etched on my brain. The date, according to my father's notes, was the 12th of the 4th, 42. The following day an army lorry arrived. The tarpaulin top was folded down, and the back was full of people we knew, neighbours and friends, standing packed like sardines because there wasn't enough room to sit down. The 2 Australian soldiers, Ginger and Harry, spoke to my father, who picked me up and turned me away. I heard 2 loud shots, and when I looked down, the 2 dogs were lying dead beside the cab. The weather was searingly hot. My mother was allowed to sit in front because she had the baby. I stood by my father, my arms wrapped tightly around his legs, and he held onto the metal structure which would have supported the tarpaulin top. Most people had a suitcase and belongings. We had nothing. As we drove off, a gust of wind blew away my straw hat, and I was most upset. I was not allowed to go out into the sunshine without my hat. The next memory is of arriving at Myitkyina Aerodrome on the 26th of the 4th, 42. It teemed with panicking humanity. Children crying, couples clinging together, people pushing each other out of the way to get to the planes which were on the ground. Someone shouting, "Women and children only." Women pleading for their menfolk to be allowed on. Belligerent men forcing their way on. Planes taking off and landing. My father thrusting us towards the plane. My mother saying she wouldn't go without him. Then the Japanese planes arrived, wave upon wave of them. They screamed low over us, machine gunning. Our planes that had taken off were exploding in the sky. Those on the ground burst into flames. They strafed the screaming, running people. Utter carnage. We ran towards some shrubs on the edge of the airfield. My father lay on top of me, my mother lay on top of my brother. Of all absurdities, my father had acquired one of those huge multicoloured golf umbrellas from heaven knows where, and opened it over us, presumably to protect us from bullets. We would have been such sitting ducks. I wonder why we survived. My mother carried the baby, and father carried me, pressing my face into his chest so I couldn't see the bodies, the annihilation. But I smelt it, the smell of burning kerosene, of death, and I heard it, the explosions, the wounded crying in agony, the living calling desperately for loved ones, weeping over their dead. My grandparents and an uncle went with a group of people who decided to try and trek through the jungle into India. They urged us to go with them. My parents said they'd take their chances, as trekking with small children seemed somewhat risky. I know that many groups set out on that journey. Very few people made it. Those who didn't succumb to the heat and merciless monsoon weather, snake and insect bites, malaria or dysentery, was shot by patrolling Japanese units or marauding groups of Burmese dacoits who killed them for their few meagre possessions. All my family members died on that trip. Shrieking Japanese separated the men from the women and children. The men guarded on one side of a concrete area, the rest of us a distance away. The fear was tangible. What was going to happen to us? Our first inkling of what was to come was when an elderly lady protested that her husband was too old to work and was slapped hard across the face for daring to complain. Her husband ran across to pick her up and was shot dead. The silence, the horror, the disbelief that this had actually happened. Eventually lorries arrived, the men were loaded onto them and driven away. The women and children were taken to what I now know as a Quaker schoolhouse. We were lined up outside in the torrid heat while the guards marched up and down, forcibly taking anything of value, tearing jewellery from necks and fingers. There were a lot of angry shouts and beatings when anyone demurred or was suspected of hiding anything. I know my mother swallowed her engagement ring, and I thought it a very strange thing to do. Here I refer to my father's notes, which say that he was sent to the military police camp as labour, along with all the other men. At that time, there were not a lot of Japanese soldiers about. Those that were there spent their time shrieking loudly to make themselves understood better. My mother found a corner in which we three huddled together. Those who were lucky enough to have been able to bring blankets and clothing with them were comfortable. We had nothing. One day someone joined us. It was my mother's best friend from our home in Mactilla, my godmother, Gina. Her husband was amongst those who were taken away to work. Fortunately, she'd been able to salvage some things and gave us a blanket. Each day we were forced outdoors to stand to attention for hours, in that hot sunshine, to bow low to any passing Jap. Women fainted, children cried. I don't know how long we were there. My brother Denny became very ill and cried constantly, a reedy, weak cry. My mother begged a Japanese soldier for permission to take him to the civilian hospital, which we heard was still functioning. Now, brutal as they were, there was still some degree of kindness towards children. This didn't last for long, and we were taken in a motor vehicle of some sort. I was permitted to go with them since there was no one with whom I could be left. A friend of my parents, Dr. James Stewart, was still working there and managed to get word to my father and have him brought to the hospital in time to say goodbye to his baby son. My brother died at 2 a.m. on the 29th of the 6th, 42, just 1 month after his first birthday. He had dysentery and food and medications were already scarce. He was buried at 5:30 p.m. the same day, according to my father's notes, Dr. Stewart and a Mr. Skinner and himself. My poor mother was not allowed to go, and we were taken straight back to the camp. My father was taken away immediately after the burial. Shamefully, my own recollections of that were very childish ones, of being jealous of the attention he was getting for some reason unknown to me, of curiosity that my parents were both crying of him, of trying to divert some of the attention away to myself by screaming that a very large centipede was coming towards me. I remember baby Denny was placed in a small green box by Dr. Stewart and carried out by my father. She had nothing of him to remember him by, and the doctor cut off a lock of his hair for her. I still have that. I am the only person alive to remember that little boy. Dr. Stewart very kindly gathered together some things in a pillowcase for us to take, a scratchy grey blanket, a bedsheet, 2 of his own shirts, the only clothes he could find, a kitchen knife, a small saucepan, and an enamel mug. He tied up some oatmeal and a piece of cloth and hid it under everything else. Again, I rely on my father's meticulous notes. We were moved from Michina on the 14th of the 7th, 42, to Saigon. Then from Saigon to Mandalay, where we were put in the brothers' school. From there we were moved on to Meade'S. We walked, I don't know how long we walked for. It was days. Once on that trip, and I remember it so well, we came to a river. It was hot and we were all tired and rushed gratefully to the water's edge. Bloated corpses had to be moved aside before we could get to the water. I still remember that stench. Eventually some lorries arrived and drove us the rest of the way. We spent the duration of the war in Meade'S. Blessedly, it was in the hills and never got too hot. Although I recollect the winter's nights being very cold and frosty, and we all, my mother, Gina and I, huddling together under one blanket to keep warm. Meade'S was a hill station resort to which people went during the hot weather, and many, including us, owned houses there. We were all taken to the British Army barracks, Alexandra Barracks, I think, and herded in. My mother and the other women were marched several miles every day with an escort to a river. Those memories still haunt my mother and reduce her to tears at the age of 85. There they stood waist deep in the rushing waters to wash filthy bandages, medical dressings, and Japanese uniforms caked in blood. She remembers women being washed away during the monsoon floods and the Japanese guards doing nothing to help them. She remembers bored guards watching the women, then selecting one and shouting, "You," and raping her. They once passed a group of men POWs, my father was amongst them, mending the road, and the screaming guards flailing around with their bayonets to prevent them speaking to each other, but they waved their blue kisses and shouted, "I love you," to each other. While our mothers were out, the children were minded by the older ladies who attempted to teach us, instilling some discipline and education into us against all the odds. I remember Mrs. Cooper teaching us how I do love to go up in a swing, up in the air so blue. I wanted to do that. I wanted to feel that. I dreamed about the wonder of it. Since books and pencils were strictly prohibited, we learned everything by rote. If our lessons were noticed by a Jap, he would stamp over and scream. They seemed incapable of normal speech. That there was to be no teach, no teach. We also quickly learned to distinguish between the sound of the Allied and Japanese planes, ignoring the Japanese ones and working ourselves up into a frenzy of excitement when the Allied ones came over. There was a lot of bombing there, because the Japanese officers housed themselves in the comfort of the more affluent of the properties there. And there was a lot of movement of troops going on in the area. One man, an Anglo-Indian, had gone berserk at the beginning of the war, throwing himself about and speaking unintelligibly, not understanding what was being said to him. So mad was he that they didn't bother interning him. Throughout the war, he used to be seen shambling around, talking to himself, arms waving. He lived rough and the Japanese just left him alone. It was easier than trying to cope with a lunatic. He was a butt of their humour, pushed about and treated with great disrespect. After the war, we heard that he had actually had the last laugh because he had been in constant contact with British intelligence and had passed on much information about the movement of British troops. Being left to his own devices, he was able to move around observing and reporting. Not so mad after all. He had previously worked with my father in Meade'S, and towards the end of the war, when I asked about him, I was a little afraid of all the ranting and arm waving. He said, "Don't be afraid of Henry, darling, he's a brave man. One day we'll all be very proud of him." I also noticed that on occasion Henry would covertly slip something into Dad's hand. Then when the local people slunk quietly around trying to sell things, they too were destitute. We would be able to get a few vegetables or a little rice. It was just after we came to this camp that the first of two particularly traumatic events occurred. A Jap officer stumped into the big barracks room in which we were all crammed, pointed to my mother and shouted, "You!" and raped her right there in front of everyone. Afterwards he beat her about the head, kicking her repeatedly when she fell, knocking her senseless. Her crime? She didn't bow low enough when she said thank you to her master. I still see my poor mum curled into fetal position, arms wrapped protectively around her head, pleading, "No more, master, no more." The hunger, the stomach griping, awful hunger pangs. We would roll on the floor in pain and nothing could be done about it. The few bags of rotting vegetables and weevil-ridden rice didn't go far. The enterprising mothers, the true heroines of war, planted some of the rotting potatoes and hallelujah, they grew. There were also turnips and herbs that they'd managed to get smuggled in, growing riotously. The only ones who didn't seem affected by hunger or deprivation were the nuns. They had been prepared, had stitched money and small items of jewellery and treasures into their gowns. They were holy women, they could not be searched. They kept their eyes down demurely and looked very saintly, but would frequently be seen bartering at the fence, a spot that was out of sight at the rear of the buildings, and people would furtively meet with someone on the outside. They did not mix with the other POWs, nor did they use their seemingly endless resources to help the sick or starving children. Smuggling was rife. One day we were told that someone wanted to see my mother at the back fence. It was one of my parents' employees. She reached in, took my hand and said, "I have something for you, Baba," and gave me an egg. I dropped it. I was inconsolable. "Don't cry, Baba. Please don't cry. I'll come again tomorrow." She crept away. She came the next day with another egg. "It won't break," she said. "I boiled it." My mother and Gina had a bite and I ate the rest. That generosity from someone who could ill afford it was humongous. We all had malaria, sweating one moment, shivering the next. There was no medication. Our bodies ached. Most of us had dysentery. Now we were all so weak, we just spent our time lying around. One night we were woken by someone screaming. One of the boys had been bitten by a rat. His mother was hitting it, but it wouldn't let go. Others joined in and it was killed. He got a fever soon after and died. One afternoon, one of the women rushed in and said she'd just seen a consignment of parcels being delivered with red crosses on them. People cried weakly. Food, we hadn't been forgotten. There was a lot of deliberation on what wonders we were about to receive and when it would be distributed. Then there was an announcement over the tannoy. There was to be a party for the children. The kind Japanese masters were going to give the childrens this party tomorrow, and many officers will be coming to see the childrens have a very good party. The mothers instructed us on behaviour. This was to be so important. The officers were not to be angered by anything, or goodness knows what would happen. Eat whatever there is to eat. If you can, bring something back. Bow low, count to 5 before you stand up. Say thank you, have a lovely party. We walked in a straight line to the front entry of the officers' quarters. They were already there, sitting around a long table on which there were several open boxes. They were smiling, which immediately put us at ease, and we smiled back. We did our bow. The officer talked to the interpreter, who told us to sit in 2 rows at the front of them. We sat and watched. A party. Some of the older ones remembered parties. There were a lot of things to eat, and you wore silly hats and sang and laughed. Then we discovered that this was not going to happen. They tormented us by opening the boxes, passing the contents to each other, stuffing it into their mouths, spitting out what they didn't like. They lit cigarettes, slapped their thighs and laughed uproariously. Tomorrow all children will write letters and say thank you. Please send more party for happy children. Someone came out with a camera. We were told to smile and wave, then we were dismissed. The weeping mothers gathered their devastated children and everyone cried. Oh, how helplessly we cried. And do you know, the following day we were each given a piece of paper with a message already written on it. We were instructed to put our names on it, and they were all put in an envelope and taken away. Another ugly event. Visiting the benjo, the Japanese word for latrine. I found the body of my mother's close friend, Gina, hanging from the rafter. She, along with other young women, had been taken away to entertain the Japanese officers and returned to the camp, and she became pregnant. The shame of her situation was too much for her, and she'd taken her own life. I rushed out shouting that Auntie Gina was swinging in the benjo. I watched as her body was brought out and laid on the ground. She was buried in the local cemetery later by her friends. This was not recorded by my father because he hadn't been aware of it until some time after. My mother was devastated. That night I was the one who did the consoling. I stroked her hair and said all the things she said to me when I was sad. Soon after this, we were moved out into the houses on Circular Road, and the Japanese army moved into the barracks. We actually moved into the bombed ruins of our own house, Mayville, with several other people. Wretched though it was better than the barracks because each of us had a room and there was a degree of privacy. My father joined us. He had been badly ill-treated. He was weak and ill. His body was covered in festering bayonet wounds. He was also suffering from malaria and violent stomach pains. The reasons for his ill treatment was that he had some tattoos on his arms that the Japanese objected to. One was of patriotic nature, the other was in Greek. Although he explained what it meant, they didn't believe and were convinced it was some kind of code. In fact, it was my mother's name with the words "true till death." We were watched carefully. Suddenly and unexpectedly, a group of soldiers would burst in, hoping to catch my father at whatever they suspected him of. It was on one of those forays that Kato-san came. Somehow, by some miracle, my mother had got pregnant. "You've got clothes for the baby?" he asked in good English. "Where would I get something like that?" she replied. Later the same day, he returned alone and pulled out a roll of flannelette material from under his jacket. He returned many times and became a good friend, often bringing foods for us. He told us about his job as a teacher in Tokyo, his sisters. He showed us photographs of them and wept. One evening he stayed longer than usual, telling us that night they were to be moved into an area where the fighting was heavier. "Kato will die," he said philosophically. He gave me a white scarf covered in hundreds of red stitches. Each stitch, he told me, was a blessing made by his wife, his mother, his sisters, and other members of his family, friends and neighbours. He told me to keep it and remember him. and remembered that he wasn't a bad Nipponese. Some are not bad, he said, but we have to fight for our emperor. That scarf is now in the Second World War Museum in Leeds. Gato's befriending of us and the benefits we reaped were a source of great envy to others in the house, who were naturally jealous of this preferential treatment. Such were the threats that we had to make sure to share whatever we got for fear of being reported. Reading my father's notes, I found that my mother clearly did not have a straightforward birth and required the help of a woman who had previously been a nurse. He goes on to say that they had to find 50 rupees to pay her. I learned later that Henry had paid for this. I'm pretty appalled that another person in the same situation, knowing the privations suffered by everyone, could have demanded payment under the circumstances. That was on the 28th of the 6th, 43. I see that she herself died on the 4th of the 9th, 43. My brother was defiantly christened Winston after Churchill. We dared not use that name, though we called him Vincent. The service was performed with the Reverend Angla, who had chosen to be interned with his parishioners and served them throughout the war. He must have been quite a man. After the war, he became the Venerable John Angla, Archdeacon of Mandalay. There's a large mansion-like house not far from where we were, where the more senior Japanese officers were billeted. It was there that we found another unlikely friend. The cook, whose name we never learned and whom we never actually saw, used to come down the lane to dispose of the carcasses of the animals that they had obtained for their consumption. They had to be thrown in a lime pit so that the POWs couldn't benefit by them. We would hear him whistling loudly as he approached, then a quantity of bones would land on our side of the hedge. There was no meat left in them, but they were nutritious and very tasty, boiled with the herbs that were rampant in the overgrown garden. This happened regularly until either he was moved on or his exploits were discovered and he was punished. The house had been further damaged by bombing, and we lived as best we could in the ruins. But now there were fewer Japanese around, although enough to watch us. Things were beginning to change. Not only was the number of Japs dwindling, but they became more careless, more jittery. Something was happening, and we didn't know what it was. We could only listen to rumours and hope that they were true. Now the Allied bombing got worse. One air raid was followed soon after it by another. The sky seemed to rain bombs, the world lacerated by the noise. We were put back into the camp. That way they needed fewer guards. My memories of this time are almost constant shelling and a feeling of suppressed excitement. People seemed to come to life again. Most of the children very ill and weak. I had dysentery, malaria, impetigo, ringworm, stomach infestations and head and body lice. I spent the time lying huddled and shivering, messing myself because I hadn't the strength to move and not caring. My poor mother, herself ill with malaria and a baby to care for, looked after my father and me with great love and solicitude. Then one day the gates were left open and the Japs vanished. A lot of them committed suicide, others bolted to the jungle to hide. I remember hearing my father say longingly, "It won't be long before I can have a cup of tea, real tea." He yearned for that simple cup of tea with milk and 2 teaspoons of sugar. This part of the story is hearsay, rather than personal memories. We were situated on a hill. The British Army were at the bottom and advancing fast. Shells whistled over us at the rapidly retreating Japanese soldiers. We could actually see the British soldiers advancing up the hill, to quote my mother, like ants. My mother, worried about the health of her husband and children, and unable to wait a minute longer, defying the hail of missiles, crawled on her hands and knees under them, went to the railway station, where she had heard the Gurkhas were entrenched. A Major Hall met her, appalled at her recklessness. "Good God, woman," he barked, "where have you come from?" "We'll be there tomorrow. We could have waited until then." She explained the situation, said simply she'd lost one child and she'd no intentions of losing another. She might not last till tomorrow, she said. They sent her back with stuff we hadn't seen for 3 years: biscuits, sugar, tea, matches, cans of bully beef and condensed milk, which he told her to mix with water and to only give me a teaspoonful at a time. "We'll be there tomorrow with the army medic," he said. The date, according to my father, was the 11th of the 3rd, 45. The next day we all went down. A soldier carried me. I was too weak to walk. And we were given rice and corn flour. I don't know how well the rice went down since, as I recall, there was little else to fill our bellies during the war. A few days later, the Red Cross were there to distribute clothing, socks, and Japanese boots and shoes. The very last entry in my father's notes tell us that on the 18th of the 3rd, 45, a Thanksgiving service and Holy Communion were held at 8 a.m. at the Garrison Church. Reverend Aunglan Chite conducted the service. Huddled together one night before falling asleep, my mother said to me, "The war and everything about it is over. If we're ever to be a normal family again, we must forget everything that happened to us. We must never speak of it again." Do you understand? I understood all right. She didn't want my father to know of the terrible things that had happened to her, just as he never told us what had happened to him, the atrocities he had witnessed. Until his death, I was aware that he often woke up crying out. I wonder what demons caused that fear. We never spoke again of it until after his death. All those rank, ugly, terrible, malignant memories were just stored away to fester. Even now she won't willingly speak of the war, but I know. She always said she'd like to go back just once to put flowers on Denny's grave and tell him that she'd never forgotten. If only it had been possible for her wish to be granted, but it's too late now. All I can do in recompense and in gratitude to those gallant men who fought for our freedom is to give as true an account as I am able, and to hope that the truth will prevail and never be forgotten. I think sensations, like you say, smells and sounds, they stick in your memory. I can remember the smell of the kerosene burning, the sounds of people crying and screaming, all that. If I hear a loud siren, I still jump. I think that sort of thing is something you never forget. Sounds and smells that related to a horror still are horrific in your head, in your soul. The smell of the carnage in the aerodrome, I can never forget that. I can never forget the sound of the explosion, watching our house explode. And the car in the drive just bursting into flames and exploding. All that type of memory is etched on my brain.
Is it still daily that you remember these things?
No, you can forget it for days and something happens, just a little memory, something triggers a memory. You can go for months and not think of it. I went for years not thinking of it because I had it instilled into me as a child. You forget it, put that away. And I did, because I didn't want to be different from anybody else. By talking of it, I was different because nobody else had known this, and they'd look at me as though I was an alien or something. And I learned not to talk about it. As an adult, I didn't talk about it. Again, because I didn't fit in if I talked about it. But I said to a friend was talking about the war once, and she said something about the sacrifices of war. And I said, "Yeah, don't I know about it?" I said, "Starvation." I said, there was no food. I tried to talk her into it, and she turned to me and said, "We suffered as well, you know." She said, "We had rations, food was on ration." And she said, "When my father went out, we didn't know if he'd come back again or not." And I thought, I don't need to talk about this because they don't understand. Nobody understands. So I didn't speak of it because nobody understood. It was only in latter years that I thought I should put this down. I should write about it. I should tell about it because it should not be forgotten. It should not be forgotten.
What was that process like, writing this down?
Painful. It's still painful reading it.
Did you find, once you started writing, that it just flowed out onto the page?
Yes, it did, but I still had to stop to collect myself every now and again. Go for a walk around the garden and come back. The garden is always my refuge. I love my garden.
And the peace and quiet as well over here.
Yep, and it's a beautiful, peaceful garden as well.
Have you ever, in your time recently, met anyone who did share those memories?
Yes, I met Jim Fenton. I knew of him, and I wanted to meet him, but somehow it didn't happen. But I went to the memorial service, and he was there. and I went and introduced myself. And the amazing thing was that he was actually amongst the soldiers who liberated us in Meade'S in Burma. He was actually one of those men, which was quite surprising and humbling.
And he shared some of his memories with us through the newspapers, through the radio. Do you identify certain things certain things that he said, some of his recollections?
Yes. What I identify with him is that it's going to happen again, and people are letting it happen. Don't let it happen. It mustn't happen. And don't be blind to it. Know it's going to happen, because it is going to happen. And Jim agrees with me on that.
Celia Meade talking to me there in her home in Kirkmichael. With a final thank you to Celia and John for their help in the development of this programme, I've been Lewis Foster, this has been Island Life. Guru Mayed, thank you for listening.